Hi everyone, and thanks very much for inviting me to talk today. And I'm going to talk about Freud's uncanny, which I think is an interesting precursor to the Beyond the Pleasure Principle essay. Freud published his essay about the uncanny in 1919, just before, 1 year before the Beyond the Pleasure Principle was published. And I think there are strong links between the two concepts that I'm going to talk about today. And this work is really based on the projects that I've been working on for the past few years in connection with people in the social science departments at the University of Edinburgh. And together with them, we've edited an anthology of new work about the uncanny, a mixture of fiction, creative writing, and academic work that we've called Uncanny Bodies. And so it's in the light of that experience of working on that project that I'm going to be talking about the uncanny today. Okay. So what is the uncanny? It's not a straightforward horror show or ghastly. It's something a bit different to that. As Freud describes it very well in his essay, it's not just a terrifying, it's that class of the terrifying which leads us back to something long known to us, something that was once familiar and has been repressed and has come to the surface. And that is what is distinctly uncanny. It's this feeling that there is a link between us and what we are perceiving as uncanny, sometimes a very intimate link. And as he says elsewhere in that essay, it's connected intimately to us and what is repressed within us. It is a doubling, dividing, and interchanging of the self, or it's a constant recurrence of the same thing. And I think it's that perhaps links it also to the death drive that he discusses in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It's this sort of compulsive repetitiveness of uncanny. So Freud, in his essay, repeatedly draws upon fictional uses and accounts of the uncanny. And in particular, he discusses at great length a famous short story by E.T.A. Hoffmann called The Sandman. Which I've got the cover of here. And this story was published in 1819, so 200 years ago for us. And in this story, there is an account of the hero falling in love with a beautiful young woman. He doesn't realize, although the reader realizes, that he's actually fallen in love with a peculiarly silent young woman. And of course, she's not human, she's an automaton. There's a lot of play on eyes and people's eyes being pecked out by the terrifying Sandman of the title, and a character who reappears throughout the story in various different guises, which connects closely, I think, to Freud's idea that something keeps coming back. There is a doubling. There is some kind of figure that is not quite within us, but is recognized by us, and that keeps recurring. He uses examples from his own life too, in particular, a fairly sort of comical example in a way of how he is wandering around an anonymous town in northern Italy and keeps getting lost, of course, in the red light district. And he has no idea why he keeps being drawn back subconsciously to this red light district. And I think it's also worth saying something about the language that he uses. The original German word is das Unheimliche. And as he discusses, unheimlich, it can mean unhomely, strange. The apparent antonym is the word heimlich, which means homely, but heimlich also means secretive. And unheimlich can also mean secrets, in that something is made secret, repressed. So as Freud points out, these two apparent antonyms can actually meet and become, in some case, synonyms. And this is what happens with the sort of standard English translation of the word, which since the Strachey's first translated this essay in the 1920s, has always been translated as uncanny. Uncanny is an interesting word, of course, in that it's standard English, but it has within it this Scots word, canny. And as with the German words too, uncanny and canny are not always antonyms. Canny can mean superstitious. It can refer to something that has some kind of supernatural element too, and in that way it can have a similar usage to uncanny. Okay. So Freud attempts in his essay to give various categories of what he means by uncanny. It refers to doubles, to doppelgangers, and so on. And what we wanted to do in our work in the Uncanny Bodies anthology was to see whether the uncanny could be updated into our own sort of present day society, particularly considering the technological advances in medicine and how we view our own bodies, both as a result of having illness or a disability and having apparent solutions and cures for those illnesses and so on. And this, I think, preoccupation with what is sort of below the surface of our own body can also be traced back to the uncanny at, say, the early 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when technological advances were being applied to medicine to allow us to see within ourselves. So this image on the screen is one of the very first X-rays that was taken in 1895 by the German physicist Röntgen. And according to what he wrote, according to scientific legend, he took X-rays of his wife's hand with her rings on it. And she's reputed to have said when she first saw these X-rays that I have seen my own death. She was so shocked and appalled by the fact that she could see beneath the skin to her skeleton that this prompted her to say this. Now we might not regard X-rays in quite the same light, and yet technological advances may still have the power to sort of disturb us and to make us see our bodies in a slightly different light, to both give us more information about our bodies, but also to slightly estrange us from our bodies, make us see our bodies as if they were slightly strange. And I think there's something of the uncanny in that process. It happened to Freud himself. Freud famously was addicted to smoking cigars, smoked so all his adult life, and he couldn't give up the habit even when he was diagnosed with having cancer of the mouth. That required him to have over 30 operations in his mouth and palate, and increasing amounts of his palate and jawbone had to be removed and placed with sort of artificial prosthetic palates, which caused him a great deal of upset and problems. He found these very difficult to tolerate in his mouth. And so I love this quotation from Civilization and Its Discontents. It's a famous quote, of course. Man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But these organs have not grown on him, and they still give him much trouble at times. And of course, this could be read metaphorically, but I like to think of him actually referring to his own prosthetic organs, if you like, that are really causing him problems in articulating, in speaking. And of course, that was so central to what he's doing. So that was then. How has the uncanny changed since 1919? Well, one of the most interesting concepts, I think, where the uncanny has met modern technology is around this concept of the uncanny valley, which was first articulated by the Japanese robotics expert Masahiro Hiri, I think his name is, I can't remember, in the 1970s. And in it, he describes this curious phenomenon in which when we develop robots in society, we experience within ourselves an increasing affinity with a robot, the more similar it appears to be a human. And that is shown in this graph here. So we're not really that attached to an industrial robot's arm in a factory, But if the robot starts to become to look more and more humanoid, we feel perhaps some sort of emotions attached to it, positive emotions. And likewise with cartoons too. We feel that that we essentially project positive emotions onto them, and that we imagine they might be actually experiencing these emotions ourselves. But what Masahiro Hiri pointed out is that there's actually a deep gap, what he termed the uncanny valley, in that rather than a sort of smooth progression between increasingly humanoid robots, such that we feel an affinity all the way up to the sort of affinity that we feel to other humans. If these humanoids appear to be quite like us, but not exactly like us, we can feel a revulsion, a fear from them. And that's actually well articulated by the response to the popular film, The Polar Express, in which a lot of people who saw that film thought that there was something sort of weird and creepy about these sort of animated human figures who looked fairly human, but not human enough. And that triggered this sort of really innate revulsion. Okay. Similarly, we ourselves can be made to feel uncanny and estranged from ourselves by this type of technology. And in the right-hand side, I've got here sort of standard image from Capture, which is essentially a Turing test, a reverse Turing test that we are being asked to carry out quite often when we log into sites to show that we are human and not a robot. I always feel anxious when I'm asked to complete one of these tests, because what if I get it wrong? What does that mean? Does it mean I'm not a human? So we're being asked to complete a test that has been set for us by an inhuman intelligence to show that, to prove to that inhuman intelligence that we are human. And there's something of the uncanny in that. So I normally live in Scotland, but at the moment I'm living in Frankfurt, a city that I moved to just before the virus kicked off. So that was really good timing. Consequently, I spend a lot of time at home. But Frankfurt is a city like many other German cities. It was, the centre of it was largely destroyed by the end of the war. And has been sort of rebuilt. So in the hinterground, in the background of this image, we have a black and white photo that was taken probably in the spring of 1945 after the British Air Force bombed the centre of Frankfurt, which up until then had been one of the largest medieval city centres in Europe. It has been largely rebuilt, part of the centre. This is a much more modern image of what is essentially the town hall, the Roma, and I've superimposed it so it kind of matches up to where it is on the hinter image. It looks very nice. It's a very appealing building, Roma. Tourists come from a long way to see it. And this, in the Roma Platz, it's surrounded by other, so apparently medieval buildings. But if you look at it closely, it's clear that it's a replica. It's a sort of simulacrum of what was there before. It's too precise, it's too neat. It's not old, it's obviously a new copy of what was there before, trying to look like it was the original. And I think this is an interesting thing to do, because it's now very difficult to actually give a precise date to what this building is. Is this a building that was built in medieval times and has simply been sort of refurbished, or is it a genuinely new building? And so it inspires with me a sort of sense of the uncanny when I walk past it. I'm intrigued by it, but I'm also slightly confused by it. And I think it's really that makes the uncanny such an interesting quantity, sort of emotion prospect for us to explore. I think that's the purpose of uncanny, It's because it's not straightforward. The uncanny is something, a quality in a thing or an organism that makes us question what it actually is. And I think the uncanny essentially shows us the futility of trying to categorize the world around us and us, because however we do it, the uncanny is able to sort of slide through those categories. It slips past them. It shows us that our attempts at classifying are always going to be limited in some sense by our limited knowledge, and that applies to us too. Our attempts to classify what is human is shown by our responses to what is not quite human to be somehow limited. Frankfurt is a city that, to the south of it, where I live, has a forest called the Stadtwald, the city forests. The forest borders the city, and in some ways, the city and the forest look very different. And yet, when you go for a walk in the forest, you're aware that whilst it looks natural on the surface, what is below the surface in this forest is very much not natural. Earlier on in the summer, there was a forest fire, and we were told to avoid the centre of the forest, as you would do. It was a very hot day, there was a fire raging, but it was not just a fire that was dangerous. It was the fact that the fire was quite possibly about to trigger the explosion of ordnance bombs buried below the surface of the forest since the end of the Second World War, because there was nowhere else to put them. So this is a forest that has an intimate connection to sort of the human history of the city, sort of literally buried within it. When you go walking in a forest, it's quite common to find on the surface of the paths bits of rubble, bits of china, bits of pottery, bits of brick. And this is because the rubble from the destruction of the cities was buried in the forest. Part of it was reused, part of it was buried in great heaps in the forest, and it keeps coming to the surface. Again, it's a reminder that you can't easily separate the natural and the unnatural. They allied, and they move between different categories by literally, physically in this case, coming to the physical sort of visual surface. Okay, I want to finish by talking about a poem that is included in the Uncanny Bodies anthology, because I want to give you a bit of a flavour of the type of work that we did during this project. And this is, I think this is a really good example of how language itself can be made to be estranged from us. So this is just the beginning of a long poem written by the poet Nicky Melville, who's based in Glasgow, and he's famous for his work taking existing texts and making something new from them, sort of erasing words to leave other words and creating different meanings. What he's done here is taken the two different translations of the Uncanny Essay by Freud, the earlier one by the Straight Cheese, and then the more recent one by David McClintock. And he's taken all the phrases that contain the word familiar from these two different translations, and he's set them out in contrast to each other in two different columns. And I'm just going to read this because I think it works really well. What was once well something long known and had long known to us, once been familiar, very familiar. The familiar can become uncanny and frightening, frightening. How this can be, I shall show in, shall emerge in what follows. Meaning may provisionally be belonging, glossed to feeling. The home at home is frightening. What is, because it is not novel, may well known, prove frightening and familiar. So I'm just going to finish by talking, just mentioning a couple other works on the uncanny, recent works on the uncanny. Comma Press put out an anthology of stories inspired by the uncanny about 10 years ago now. And as some of you might know, there are two academics in Britain, one at Manchester and one at Sussex University, both called Nicholas Royal, and they've both produced work on the uncanny. One of them has written an academic book about the uncanny called The Uncanny, and the other one has produced a collection of short stories about the uncanny. And they refer to each other, of course, in these works. How can they not? And I think that's an excellent place for us to stop. So thank you very much, and